There has been a lot of advantages to the advancements in technology. From laser technology that allows brain surgeons to operate precisely in cutting the skull with laser technology, or whether it's prosthetics advancements that are giving people, veterans or others, limbs and prosthetics that would be equivalent to something that you would see in a Marvel superhero movie. There's been so many advancements in medical technology, but not limited to medical technology. There's been so many advancements lately in even computer technology. I'm thankful that my computer is backed up wirelessly, automatically to two separate locations, one to the cloud and one to an external hard drive. And I set up those backups that I have on my computer because at one time my computer crashed and I almost lost everything, from baby photos of when my babies were born and being birthed, and wedding photos, and my life's work and ministry, and all of my sermons that I've prepared over the last 9 years at Regenerate, and almost it was all gone. Luckily, we were able to recover it, but I learned my lesson. It's important to have a backup. And so now, because of technology, I'm able to back up my computer to two separate locations for safety and for security. So I have those backups. Backups are important, not only for our computers, but also for our brains. In my pocket, I have with me, and what many of you have in your pocket, is a cell phone. But it's more than just a phone. It's really a computer device that we use for so much than just a phone call. Most of us use it. One of the last and least things that we do with it is actually calling people on the phone. But we have with us a device that is for a lot of us, our brain's backups, where we can now set reminders in the app Reminders to remind us that we have a doctor's appointment, or that we have a recital to get to, or that we have something to be at an appointment. Not only are there reminders, but you can write notes down for things that you would normally forget, that you can write those notes down so that you can reference to them later. So you have reminders, you have the notes, you have all sorts of things. We use it for our calendar. My wife and I, we sync up our calendar with each other, so when she adds something on her calendar, it adds it to my calendar under her name so I can see what she has going on for the day, and so we don't overbook or overcommit ourselves. And it's really great because without the smartphone, I don't know where I would be. I wouldn't have been here this morning if it wasn't for my phone waking me up this morning, my alarm going off for me to get to church. And we depend so much on the technology for great reminders to remember important things that we don't want to miss. Before the smartphones, there was something called Palm Pilots. How many of you, with a show of hands, remember Palm Pilots? How many of you, with a show of hands, had a Palm Pilot? Those were great. I mean, if we have smartphones today, we could refer to those as dumb phones. They didn't do much, but what was great is you could write certain things down and keep your calendar digitally. It was like the first advancement of that. I wonder in 20 years if anybody will know what a Palm Pilot was. I'll have to give this same message again in 20 years and see if anybody remembers. But before we had Palm Pilots, well, there's all sorts of other things we used to do for our brain's backup, for those reminders that were important for us to have. We had day planners and day schedulers. We had project lists, AKA known as honey-do lists, because your honey wants you to do this and do this and do this, and if you don't write it down on the project list, it won't ever get done. Other reminders included personal planners and bullet journals, agendas, and all sorts of other things that we would use for our brain's backup. Knowing that we can't remember it all and that we need to have a reminder of what we need to accomplish or what has been done. But before all of those, well, there's something called the Post-it. How many of you know what this is? How many of you, with a show of hands, still use them? Apart from all the technology that's given, we still use the sticky paper called Post-its. Many of us still use them today, and they're very beneficial. You can stick them anywhere, and they don't leave a residue. But this isn't a sales pitch on Post-it, because 3M, the company that produces Post-its, doesn't need a sales pitch on Post-its. You see, 3M, the company that has manufactured and have made Post-its, its market cap is $119.9 billion. $119.9 billion with a B. And their staple product? The Post-it. The Post-it is what skyrocketed this company because of one simple truth that I want each of us to remember. And if you need a Post-it, I have them available after service. One simple truth that we need to remember today. It's something that this company literally banked on with the Post-it. Our brains need reminders. Our brains need a backup. Our brains, although very special and created very uniquely, our brains forget 92% of the information it receives. That's why when you meet somebody and you hear their name and you meet the next person and hear their name, you've already forgotten the first person's name. Your brain automatically goes, nope, you don't need that. Nope, you don't need that. As a pastor, names are important to me, but I'm horrible with names, so don't judge me. Thankfully, I have a lot of other great people that are great with names, because when you know someone's name, it makes them feel known and important. So I've tried to overturn my brain's functionality of discarding things that it thinks aren't important and labeling them as important. But our brains, they forget 92% of the information they take in. Now, before you think that you got gypped, and that shouldn't be the case, you need to realize that your brain is a very special hard drive. And your brain actually remembers just in the 8% of the information that it maintains and holds on to is enough information to fill 170 million volumes of books. 170 million. Now, to put that in perspective, that's 10 times the amount of books that is in the Library of Congress. That is a lot of information. And so your brain naturally discards other things that it doesn't hold on to. And so although we remember incredible amounts of information, most things that we see, that we hear, that we learn, we forget. So we have Post-its and day planners and calendar reminders and smartphones and all sorts of things to be backups to our brain, to help our minds remember. But this isn't a new principle. God, knowing our human nature and knowing that we so easily forget things that we sometimes ought to remember, like your wife's anniversary, your anniversary too, or your wife's birthday, things that you ought to remember that some men so easily forget. God, knowing our human nature and know how easy it is for us to forget things that we ought to remember, oftentimes would tell his people to compile stones as a memorial, as a reminder, as a monument of what God has done, so that when they move forward into the next challenge, that they would remember what God has done, so it would give them greater faith in moving forward in what God has not yet done. Oftentimes we forget the great things that God has done in our lives. And so as we look forward to the next challenge, the next situation we walk through, oftentimes we lack the faith that we need in trusting God in the current situation, because we've forgotten the past situations that God has already seen us through. And so God, knowing our propensity, would tell his people often, the people of Israel, to build these monuments to commemorate the victory that God has given them supernaturally, to never forget what God has done. And today, that's what we are doing. Today's a special service. You're going to have an opportunity to hear from a few different people today of what God has done in people's lives and in and through this ministry over this past year as we remember the great things that God has done. We see God do this time and time again. After 40 years of the people wandering in the wilderness, in our text today in Deuteronomy chapter 27, Moses is about to let Joshua lead the people of Israel into the promised land. Joshua was Moses' successor. And as Moses is about to hand off the ministry of leading the people of Israel, Moses gives the people this one last command. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 2 and 3, "So it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan to the land which the Lord your God gives you, that you shall set up for yourself large stones and coat them with lime, and write on them all the words of this law when you cross over, so that you may enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you." Moses, thinking about the people that he would no longer be leading, and the most important thing that they would need in their life, the most important thing that they would need to do to be able to step in and receive all that God has for them. He tells them to take some stones, coat them with lime, and then write on them, etch into those rocks the great things that God has done. Moses told the people to do that because Moses also knew their propensity. Because the people that Moses was leading often forgot what their past life was like. For example, when Moses led the people out of Egypt, and God delivered the people out of Egypt and answered their prayers for 400 years. They were in bondage in Egypt, and God finally leads them out as he raises up the deliverer Moses. Well, he goes to be their deliverer, and at first they say, "Well, who are you? We don't know you. Like, why are you trying to do this? You're going to make things worse for us." And things got worse for them. The more times Moses asked for them to be released, the harder they had to work, and so they resented Moses. And then after finally God delivered them out of Egypt, and now they go an 8-day journey from Egypt to Kadesh Barnea, which would be the entry point into the promised land. It's only an 8-day journey. And when they got there, they sent 12 spies in, Joshua and Caleb, 2 of those 12. But when they went in, the other 10 spies were caught up in fear and unbelief that God could give them that land because there were giants in the land. And so when they came back and gave the report, they said, it truly is a land flowing with milk and honey. There's so much blessing and the land is fertile. It is all that God said it was, but there's a problem. There's giants in the land. And so we can't take the land. And it says there was one reason why they did not enter into the promised land. One reason why they could not receive all that God had promised to them. It was because of their unbelief, which is in essence a lack of faith. When we lack faith, believing in God that he will do what he said he will do, no matter the opposition, no matter the giant obstacles or opposition that stand in our way, that God still will do what he said he would do. And so they didn't enter in that day. And so for 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness. And in the 40 years, God said, I will not allow this generation to take the land because of their unbelief. And so because of that, they will wander in the wilderness. But Joshua and Caleb, because they believe, they'll be able to enter in with the next generation. And so now Joshua and Caleb are waiting for 40 years for a generation to literally die off. They're just waiting. Hey, did you hear? No. What? Rabshakeh, he got sick. Oh, praise the Lord. Another one died today. Oh, down to 10. We're getting closer. 5 left. Oh, praise God. Finally, that generation dies, all those that were over 18, and Caleb and Joshua were allowed to lead the people into the promised land. But it's interesting, when Moses was leading the people in that 40-year period of time in the wilderness, they began to complain to Moses. At first, God provided miraculously and intervened supernaturally for them and fed them manna from heaven. It was this bread that formed from the dew of the morning. It was a supernatural food. It was something similar to maybe angel's food cake, because it was food from God. And so the people had that and they were thankful for it, but after long, they began to get sick of it. I can't eat this food from heaven, this manna, one more day. I want some meat. And so God, he provided supernaturally, and he sent quail through their camp, flying at 3 feet high, which is, if you've ever played baseball, the strike zone. And they would take bats, and these quail would fly right low through their camp because God would send them through, and they would just get up in the morning and play some baseball. First time it's ever recorded in the Bible. They would bat down these birds. And so they would have quail, but then they began to complain against the Lord again, and they constantly grumbled. And it got to a point where they said, we're just going to go back to Egypt. We had it so good back there. Really? For 400 years, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the persecution and the harsh taskmasters of Egypt, making bricks in the mud pits day after day, having just to stomp the mud and form bricks, hard, back-breaking manual labor while you're being whipped and beaten. Oftentimes your wife's taken and by the soldiers and abused. And all sorts of horrible atrocities were taking place in Egypt. But because they forgot how bad it was, and they also forgot how great God was in delivering them and all the miracles that God did to bring them out of Egypt, after a short period of time, they forgot about it. And the people of Israel even went on record and said, we had it so good back in Egypt, we even had melons and leeks. We had just an abundant harvest we could feast on. Actually, historians in studying that passage have researched every record of history and archaeological finding, never to find anything ever mentioned about melons or leeks ever in Egypt at that time. What they were remembering wasn't even reality. They didn't even have those things there, but they just thought, man, it was so good back there because they forgot what God has done. And so Moses, knowing the propensity of the people, tells them his last instruction to them to write down how God has intervened on behalf of you miraculously, supernaturally, so that you wouldn't forget moving forward, so that you would have greater faith in moving forward. Listen, if we forget the testimony of what God has done, we will lack the trust in what God will do. But if we never forget the testimony of what God has done, we will continue to trust in God for what he will do. And as a church, it's so important to remember what God has done. And so as a church, we have set aside one day out of the year, our monument service, to add a few more rocks to the pile of stones of what God has done in and through this ministry, to celebrate what God has done, to remember the great works that God has done, to give us greater trust to move forward with what God wants to do in and through his church, so that we would take bold steps of faith forward. Sometimes steps of faith are hard to take, but when we remember how God has met us every step of the way, it's no longer as difficult as it normally would be. And so today we want to share a few stories with you. A few stories of what God has done this past year. A few stories of the great works that God has done. So that we, each of us, in hearing what God has done in just a few people's lives that really represent all of our lives and the great things that God has done in our lives, it would give us, as we hear the testimony, greater trust to move forward with God. So today, we build monuments as we remember the victory that God has given in intervening supernaturally, miraculously, so that we can move forward together. God has called us to be a church that makes such an impact in the world that the world will never be the same. And we see that in the conclusion of our story in Joshua chapter 3. We see the story pick up, and I want to close here with this, of Joshua and Caleb actually being able to enter into the promised land and lead the people. And in Joshua chapter 3, we don't have time to get into it, but we see the story of God miraculously drying up the Jordan River in a time that it would be at flood zone. When it would be, in over your head to try to walk across the Jordan River, you'd be swept away. But God miraculously dried up the Jordan River when they put their feet in. When they took steps of faith forward, it was then that they saw God work. And then Joshua was told by God to do just what Moses told the people to do in Joshua chapter 4. That after all the people had crossed the Jordan in verse 1, the Lord said to Joshua, "Now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had chosen, one from each tribe of Israel, and he told them, "Go into the middle of the Jordan in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone and carry it out on your shoulder." These were big boulders. 12 stones in all, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And we will use these stones to build a memorial or a monument. In the future, your children will ask you, "What do these stones mean?" And then you can tell them, "They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever." You see, God told them to put those stones that future generations, our kids, when they're a part of Regenerate Church, our grandkids, when they're part of Regenerate Church, when they ask, "How did this start?" we'll have monuments, we'll have stones, and every single year we just add a couple more rocks, a couple more stories to what God has done each and every single year of our church. And it's important to build monuments unto the Lord, because in the days to come, they'll not only be a reminder to the people, but also to those who don't know Jesus. Because it's not only a reminder for us to have greater trust, but it's a testimony to others who don't yet know Jesus of what God can do in their life too.